What's up everyone and welcome back to the channel. So I really have nothing against butt rock, alternative rock, hard rock, middle of the road, mainstream rock. I actually appreciate so much of it. However, and I know this is not a good way to start a video. If someone said to me we're gonna go on an 8-hour drive from Czech Republic where I live to a vacation in Croatia, and we're only gonna listen to bands like Skillet, Nickelback, 3 Days Grace, Blackstone Cherry, Saliva, etc., I'd be like, I don't know, I kind of need some more variety than that. I really like it, I just don't listen to it very often, but I have a real soft spot for a band called Shinedown, who I've only really been into for the last 6 years or so, since I saw them at Download Festival back in 2016. However, this band had been going for about 20 years, and they were born out of a previous band that Brent Smith was involved in. And they've been going for quite a long time, but it's really been the last 6 years where they've really skyrocketed and become this arena band. They've transitioned from an opening act who maybe would play at 3 or 4 p.m. at a festival, maybe not even on the main stage, to a massive blow up arena act. They have had 17 #1 singles on the Billboard rock chart, and all of their singles have released the top 5. That's amazing. They have 7 studio albums released, although I wouldn't say it was until Sound of Madness, which came out in 2008, that they really blew up. This is really what skyrocketed their career, and it's also where a slight change of sound happened. Since then, they have also had a slight lineup change, and everything they seem to be doing just seems to be getting better and better, which is surprising because a lot of stuff can happen over the course of a band's career. The bands who were big in 2001 and were maybe even headlining festivals back then sometimes only play theaters in the year 2022. Some bands really blow up after only 3 or 4 years of being together, and then they sort of fall off a little bit. But with Shinedown, it actually seems like they just keep growing and growing, even 2 decades into their career. They never peaked and then stayed there. They never fell off. They just kept going. And I really want to talk about their history today because they're quite an interesting band. Going from Brent's previous band, Dreve, who sound like this, to more ballady bangers such as Get Up. Also, I'll Follow You. That was a real crossover hit for them. Having their music covered on American Idol, supporting bands like Iron Maiden, Alter Bridge, all of this amazing stuff. And I've got to say, even though sometimes they may be an opening act at these big arenas, although they do arena tours themselves, they seem to really steal the show. So let's back it up, shall we? But of course, hit that subscribe button if you appreciate my music, news, reviews, and general chit chats. It is the most helpful thing that you can do for the channel. So Brent Smith's former band Dreve were signed to Atlantic Records back in 2000. However, the label weren't very happy with the band. Perhaps they didn't like the demos, perhaps just the songwriting wasn't quite there, or perhaps they just weren't good enough. Therefore, the band were dropped, but they decided to keep Brent Smith on, as he's a talented vocalist and he's very passionate about it, I'm sure. Got kind of like a Beartooth situation going on here. For those of you who don't know the band Beartooth, it's only actually Caleb who I think is signed to Red Bull Records. The other 4 members, they're part of the band, but they're more musicians for live performances than they are for the studio, and they don't have a deal with the record label. Brent then went on to recruit Brad Stewart. They worked together on a few demos in a studio, and through connections at the studio, I think the owner's fiance happened to be Jason Todd, and the audition drummers landing on Barry Kirch, who is still their drummer today. After Atlantic Records heard their demos, they greenlighted their first album, Leave a Whisper. And this album wasn't necessarily an immediate success, but it has certainly left a legacy for the band because 45 is still a very popular song for them, as is their cover of Lynyrd Skynyrd's Simple Man. But I think one reason why it took Shinedown so long to get where they are is they sort of just kind of missed the boat. Remember that this album was released in 2003. I strongly believe that if Shinedown had started maybe 5 years earlier, they would have been perfect, right? And they would have already been doing arenas and stuff by 2005. My reasoning for this is that in the late 90s, post-grunge, hard rock, butt rock, mainstream rock, alternative rock, etc., that was at its peak. We also had a bunch of new metal, which was super popular. Bands such as Puddle of Mudd were dominating the charts, and they were getting played on all the mainstream networks as well. 1998 to 2002 was like a perfect time to be releasing those albums, getting on those tours, playing those festivals, etc. But by 2003, things had slightly changed, even though this genre was still very, very popular, and bands such as Nickelback and even Puddle of Mudd were still crushing it in 2003. The atmosphere had changed from new metal and grunge and post-grunge and mainstream rock to more niche subgenres. Things such as post-hardcore, emo, and pop punk were starting to take over a whole lot more, and radio rock, butt rock was sort of getting left behind. And it wasn't until a few years later with albums such as Us and Them and The Sound of Madness where they went from this slightly heavier hard rock to a real radio-friendly hard rock. And that's why songs such as Sound of Madness, Devour, and I'll Follow You really worked so well for them. But also most notably Second Chance. Now this was almost just a regular rock song, and it did so well for them. This was what really got them some crossover appeal from other mainstream audiences who weren't really into rock music whatsoever. But I've skipped ahead a little bit, so let's just fill in the gap between 2003 and 2008, which I don't think is that eventful. But just to let you guys know, they were on a tribute album to Queen. They got on some really good tours, which is other bands such as Seether and Hailstorm, Godsmack, etc. Pretty standard stuff. Godsmack, Hailstorm, Blackstone Cherry, these heavier hard rock bands, they all go hand in hand, and it's obvious that Shinedown would be lumped in with them for tours. They released Us and Them in 2005, but I would actually say that this was their least, I don't want to say successful album, but their least renowned album in terms of critical success and sales. And also the singles released from the album, Save Me, I Dare You, and Heroes, they were more successful chart-wise than the previous album's singles, but in general, they're not as memorable. They're not really a mainstay on the band's set list, etc. 2008's Sound of Madness, which I think was like a real breakthrough for them. And these songs are still extremely popular to this day. They still appear on the set list. People still love them. They still sing along to them. So let's get into that. Because this was also a production that was filled with quite a lot of drama. Lead singer Brent Smith at the time had some issues with drug addiction and I think alcoholism. Along with guitarist Jason Todd, they were really butting heads at the time. Bassist Brad Stewart was also fired due to disagreements. This was obviously 15 years ago, so I can't divulge into it too much, but Stewart was very unhappy with the decision, posting a lengthy MySpace blog at the time. But as Smith is not only the lead singer, but the real driving force behind the band, one of the creative forces, the band leader, etc., it's only natural that he might feel entitled to fire the other members of the band. And it all worked out for the best, because since that happened, this is where real success came for them. And I'm not blaming Jason Todd or Brad Stewart for that. It's just that the new dynamic of the band seems to work so much more for them. So Zach Myers, who is their current guitarist and back then was a touring guitarist, was recruited to a full-time member. Nick Perry, who plays in other bands such as I think Silvertide and has toured with other major acts such as Matt Sorum, he was recruited as a guitar player just for this album. He also appeared in some of the music videos and the promotional material, but left shortly after. And bassist Eric Bass has been recruited to the band by this point, and this lineup has stayed the same for the 14 to 15 years since. It's been great. So they released Sound of Madness, and this absolutely dominated. Oh man, you got Devour, Second Chance, Sound of Madness, If You Only Knew, Diamond Eyes. For those of you who don't know, Second Chance was absolutely massive. It still is. It's still one of the most popular songs. Devour is one of my personal favorite songs from them. It's a great hard rock song, which also has a mainstream appeal. And just to talk a little bit about the album as a whole, it did extremely well. It debuted at number 8 on the Billboard 200 top album charts. It sold 50,000 copies in its opening week. There's also fan favorites on the album, such as What a Shame, actually, which was briefly alluded to. If you watch the live performance from the band in London, there's actually a small clip about Brent talking about that. So that's obviously still a song which is renowned by fans very, very well. And it's quite obvious on this album that they had changed their sound. They'd gone from straight up hard rock with heavy metal influences to more of an alternative metal, mainstream rock, and also post-grunge sound, which just worked so well for them. And since then, it's been such smoother sailing. Not only did this obviously catapult them to stardom in a way they hadn't seen before, but that lineup has stayed the same ever since, and everything they've done since has been extremely successful. So let's quickly dive into that. So due to the success of Sound of Madness, the band were now able to headline much larger arenas. They went on the Carnival of Madness tour, which I think also had Blackstone Cherry on it. They were playing 10,000 capacity venues. We're talking venues almost as big as the O2 Arena in London or Prague. Footage from this tour was used on one of their live DVDs a few years later. It was a real banger of a tour, very successful. In 2012, they released Amaryllis. I don't have much to say about this album, but it did have Bully, Enemies, I'll Follow You on it. These singles were not as successful as the ones from Sound of Madness, but they are still extremely successful, especially I'll Follow You. Bully and Unity topped the Billboard mainstream rock charts. I'll Follow You peaked at number 2, so that's really good. This album didn't really have much crossover success though, because sometimes when a band releases something which does very, very well in the rock charts, it's really great if it can also do well in the mainstream charts, because then it will get more airplay, more money, more fans. Sometimes it can introduce other audiences to hard rock, which is also a great thing, right? But aside from Bully, which got on the top 100, but it was at number 94, this album didn't really seem to have much of that crossover success, but that's fine, because a few years later, in 2015, they released the single Cut the Chord, which was attached to the album Threat to Survival. And the reason I said things seem to keep getting better and better for Shinedown is because this was, again, one of their best charting and most commercially successful albums and singles. This was one of the most streamed and also one of the most successful mainstream rock songs of the year 2015. Threat to Survival was a certified gold album, which I know in these days doesn't mean very much, but considering that streaming has been so popular for the last few years, that's still a very, very good thing. And again, this was a real transition period for the band, because I think between this album and Attention, it seems that their success seems to just keep rising and rising, because they've gone from playing theaters in the mid-2010s to playing more and more arenas. They're currently on an arena tour for Planet Zero. And they went from being a co-touring band with bands such as Breaking Benjamin, 3 Days Grace, and the aforementioned Hailstorm, those other mainstream radio rock and also hard rock bands, right? To being an opening act for the major bands. It was in 2019 they supported Iron Maiden. They also did the massive O2 show with Alter Bridge. And if you know the music industry or you know how promotion works, getting on these major tours is a real big deal for these kind of bands. 2018's Attention did even better than Threat to Survival, with the lead single Devil going to number 1 on the active rock and mainstream rock charts. Attention went to number 1 on the top rock albums, hard rock albums, and alternative albums charts. And this is why I say that Shinedown had such an interesting history, because are we still looking at Saliva and Seether and Blackstone Cherry in the same light as we're seeing Shinedown? These bands are not doing these mind-blowing arena tours. They're not getting support slots with bands such as Iron Maiden. They're not releasing albums which are charting that well. And this is 20 years into the career. So many of those 2000s butt rock and radio rock and alternative rock and post-grunge and new metal bands have, I don't want to say fallen off, because they still have a great, great, great fan base. They're still releasing music, and bands like Puddle of Mud, I think, even have like their own festival and stuff like that. So they're still successful touring bands, but are any of them still releasing albums that go to #1? Are any of them still releasing singles which are appearing in multiple charts? I would say the exception to this rule is probably Five Finger Death Punch are still doing extremely well. Hailstorm are still doing extremely well. There are various other bands, obviously, this is all off the top of my head, but with many bands, you'd expect it to be like rise, 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 and then fall off a bit. But it seems with Shinedown, it's like, oh yeah, oh great, Sound of Madness, yeah, cool. Oh look, Morales, that did really well in 3 charts. Oh, Threat to Survival, cool, Cut the Cord did extremely well. Awesome, it's a really, really highly streamed song. Oh, Attention, Attention, now we're talking. It's gone constant rise, and it's been like the venues have got bigger, the fan base has got bigger. And I would say that Attention, Attention as well in 2018 was a real game changer for them, purely because there are so many songs on the album that would appeal to a wider audience, most notably Get Up. When I first played this song to my wife, who isn't really into this kind of music, she was like, wow, this sounds almost like Imagine Dragons or something like that. Is that a bad thing? No. A lot of people hate on Imagine Dragons, and a lot of people would hate on a band who would release a mainstream song which sounds akin to Imagine Dragons. But it's amazing that Shinedown can still put out these heavy songs such as Monster and Devil, but also put out these ballady rock songs such as Get Up, such as I'll Follow You, such as their cover of Simple Man. This doesn't happen for every band, and I honestly think it was that 2008 change in dynamic and change in lineup that really worked so well, because bearing in mind that bass player Eric Bass, or Eric Bass as I like to call him, actually produced some of the albums as well. They are currently touring and they are promoting Planet Zero, some new work. But if you're a fan of the band, or if you've followed their journey for the last 20 years, let me know what you think down in the comments. What's your view on this band? Why or how are they so successful, and why are they doing so well? What do you think that magic touch they have is? Awesome, guys. I hope you've enjoyed this brief history of Shinedown. Lots of love. Hit the subscribe button to help the channel out if you want to, and I'll see you in the next video.